In this video, I'll help you get started using Git and GitHub to track your Salesforce customizations. What we'll do is retrieve a simple flow from your Salesforce dev org using the Salesforce CLI, a manifest file, and Visual Studio Code. Then we'll initialize a local repository, add the files, the Salesforce customization files to it, and then upload those files to a GitHub account so that they can be shared on the internet. All right, so let's get started. Okay, the first thing we want to do is open up Visual Studio Code. And here, if you don't already have a terminal window open, you can go to the terminal menu and say New Terminal. But since I use the terminal all the time, I already have one open by default. So what we want to do is open our Salesforce org, our dev org, that already has our simple flow built into it. So we do SFDX, force org list. And I've already authorized a few Salesforce orgs on my CLI. And so the one we're concerned about here is the one with the alias client intake. So I'll open that org by typing SFDX force org open -u, and we'll use the client intake alias. So that'll open up a browser window with our setup already logged in on this instance. And here we are in setup. So I'll show you that in here we go to flows. And I've already built a very simple flow that triggers off of a custom object. So this client intake flow right here, this just triggers off of a client intake custom object that I've created. And all it does is turns around and creates a new contact record based on a couple of the fields in the client intake custom object. So let's close that guy. So what I'd like to do is open up Package Manager and let Salesforce find the flow dependencies for me. So if we go into Package Manager in Setup, and I create a new package, and we can delete this later because we're not actually going to use this for anything other than finding the dependencies. I can type client intake flow, which you can see I've already done this. And we can save that. I can go down here to the components and I can add a dependency. So in this case, we want a flow definition. So if I hit the F key and get down to flow definition, select that, you can see that the only custom flow in my org is this client intake flow that I just showed you. So let's check that box and say add to package. And from there, you can see that Salesforce has already discovered that I need the client intake list view. I need the client intake custom object that it triggers off of. I need a custom field on the contact record that I've created in order to link back to what client intake created the contact record. I need the client intake page layout. I need the flow definition itself. And I also need the client intake custom field that I've put onto the custom object. Now what we're going to do is go through each of these items and add them to our manifest file. But before we do that, we have to open up Visual Studio Code and create an SFDX project with a manifest file and link it to this org so that we can use the CLI to retrieve the files. So let's minimize this browser window, go back to Visual Studio Code, and let's go to the command palette, Control-Shift-P, and say create project with a manifest. If this doesn't pop up to the top for you, you can just type the word create and it'll filter through. So we're going to create a project with manifest. Now, the manifest file is kind of like a manifest on a flight. It's a list of all the passengers that go onto a flight. In this case, it's a list of all of the things that make up our package or that we pull down into our project in this case. So we want to create an empty project template because we don't want any extra folders that this command actually creates. And we're going to call this client intake flow. And I like to put all my files into a source repo. Okay, so Visual Studio and the CLI, the Salesforce CLI, have created this project for us. We have a manifest file here called package.xml. So if we click on that, by default, it's telling Salesforce that we want to include all custom Apex classes, all custom Apex components, pages, test suites, triggers, all this kind of stuff. We're just doing a simple flow for right now. We don't actually use any of these types. So we don't use the Apex trigger type. We don't use the Apex test suite type. We're just going to delete all but one of these that we will leave for a template. Not sure why that popped up. So let's highlight this, hit backspace, and now we just have one that we can use to get started. Oh, actually, the first thing we should be doing is setting our default org to our client intake org. So right here, we aren't set to the right org. So let's click on that. And hopefully our command palette will pop up to the switch to default org. Sometimes the first couple times you run extensions here, it's a little slow. There we go. So we want to set our default org. Oh, no, we were already okay. We already had this default org. So if I click down here normally, I go right into this command palette list, and you can see it gives me a list of all the authorized orgs in my Salesforce CLI. And in this case, we want to scroll down to the client intake org. So we're going to click on that. And now the client intake org is our default org. So now we're all set up. Now we need to modify our manifest file, our package.xml, to include all of the dependencies that the Salesforce package manager told us we have. So let's go back to the Salesforce package manager. Okay, so let's get started adding the package manager dependencies to our manifest file in Visual Studio Code. First of all, we're going to skip the list view object here, and we'll get back to that in a second. We're going to start off with the custom client intake object that triggers our flow. So if we go in here and we change the name of the type to custom object, and we put in the name of our custom object, which is client intake _C, which if we go back to our Salesforce instance, if we clicked on this, open a new tab, we want to get the API name, as you probably know. Well, that's not the right way to do it. Here we go, object manager, client intake C. So that's the API name of the object we want to add to our manifest file. So there it is. Now, if we save that and right click on the package XML and say retrieve source and manifest from org, that will pull down the files that represent our custom object. And we can see this objects folder just got created, and it has the client intake object, which has all the settings that you can set in the Salesforce UI. And in addition to that, it has the default all list view. So that's why we skipped the list view in the first place, because when you pull the custom object down, you get the list view for free. Great. So now let's move on to the next object, or the next dependency of our flow. So if we go in here, we see that the contact has a custom field on it that maps back to the client intake object that created it. So let's copy our little template here, and we will change the name of this to custom field, and we will say contact, and let's get the API name of our custom field. See where this takes us. API name is client intake _C, _C, just as you'd imagine. Just want to show you how to find it if you're having any trouble. So there's the name of the custom field. So if we save that, go back to our manifest file and say retrieve source, we can see that another folder will be created. There's our client intake, and now we have a contact folder, with the client intake field represented in it. So there we go. We have all of our object and field files down in Visual Studio Code right now. So let's close those two tabs. We don't need those anymore. And let's go look at the page layout. So we need this client intake page layout, but these are tricky to find the names of. So what I do, and this is maybe a little bit lazy, but sometimes I like being lazy. Let's grab another one of these type elements. And let's just use the star command, and we're going to pull down all of the layouts in our org. So page layout is the type we want, I believe. No, it's just layout. We just want a layout type. Well, let's get all of them. So when we do this, it'll pull down into a layout folder all the layouts in our org. And we really just want the name of our client intake one. So that's the name we want right there. So if we say rename and include the name of it, just copy that. We can then go over to our manifest file, which is way down here, and substitute that for our star. Go back to our layouts folder, and I'll just delete this folder. Save our manifest file, re-download, or re-retrieve. Okay, so now we have a layouts folder that only has our client intake in it. So a little bit dirty, a little bit messy, but it's one way to find the name of it quickly. Okay, so now we move on and we need the client intake flow definition file. So if we go back to our package XML manifest file, grab another one of these type elements, and we want flow is the type name, and the name of our flow is client intake flow. Does it have underscores? I believe it has underscores. Okay, so we save that, retrieve source from manifest. And now we have the XML file that defines our little custom flow here. Okay, so we're almost there. Oh, we already have the custom field for the email on the client intake object. If we go back here, that came down when we got the object. So if I go back to my objects and say client intake and go to fields, there's already the custom email field there. Great. So we officially have all of the files that Salesforce says this flow depends on. So at this point, this is a good point where we can create our Git repository. So in order to add these files to Git, the first thing you have to do is go to this source control tab, or I'm not sure what they call these menu items, but this is the official Git symbol. So you click on that and it says this folder is not currently a Git repository. So we want to make this folder a Git repository. Click this button. And now all of these files are eligible to be added to Git. Now the problem is we don't actually want to add a lot of these files to Git. So all of these CLS files are just part of a standard SFDX project. So you see everything has SFDX as the folder name. We don't want SFDX folder, and we don't want the SF folder. So the standard way to not add certain kinds of files to Git or certain folders to Git is to create what's called a Git ignore file. So we'll do that now. Go to File Explorer, and in the root of your project, you create a file called .gitignore, just like that. And in here, we can just list those two directories. So we can say .sf we don't want, and we can say .sfdx we don't want. And as soon as I save that file, do you see over here where it says 72? It's saying 72 files are eligible to be added to Git right now. But once we save this git ignore file, that number goes down to 13. So now we're ignoring those two directories, the .sf and the .sfdx directories. And you can see now these files are the ones that we actually want to put into our Git repo. There are custom object definition XML files, our manifest file, and some JSON files that define the SFDX project. Great. So let's just add all those guys. Let's do it the kind of clunky way here. There's probably a better way to do this. I usually use Git on the command line, so I'm not real well versed in how the VSCode Git UI works, but here we go. We'll do it the ugly way. Okay, and then in here, you really want to add a message, because what we just did, we just added the files to what's called a commit. So Git works in commits. You can think of a commit as just a package of changes that are labeled, and you can jump between those change packages. You can jump between those commits and see different versions of your files. So in this case, this is our first commit. So we're going to say initial commit of the client intake flow. And we're going to say commit. Now, we've committed to Git our changes. Now, if we want to make those changes available on GitHub so that other people that don't have access to our computer can access our files, we can click this Publish Branch button. And it'll ask us, okay, do you want to publish to a private GitHub repository that no one can see without your permission? Or would you like to make it public on the internet for everyone to see? They can clone it, which means they can download it to their computers and they can potentially fork it. We're going to create a public repository because I want you guys to be able to see this. So let's click on that. And that will automatically create a new repository under my GitHub account. And it says successfully published client intake flow with my username to GitHub. So we can go look at that by clicking open on GitHub. And you can see all of those files that make up our SFDX project are on GitHub. So let's click that. You can see our folders. If you click objects, there's our client intake object. And then there's our one client intake custom, our one custom field in the contact object. So now anyone that wants to collaborate on your project can go to your GitHub account and download those files. Okay, so the next step here is to make changes to our files and see what putting our files into Git and GitHub gets us from a change tracking perspective. So if I go back to my object manager in my development org here, and let's go find our client intake object. And let's just add a new field to our client intake object. Let's just add a text field. And I'm going to say description. Pretty common thing to put on to an object. We'll give it a length of 128. And we'll save that. So now that we have another custom field on our custom object, I can go back to Visual Studio Code and I can go straight to our package XML. So because we have the entire custom object, the entire client intake custom object specified in our manifest file, I can right click on package XML, retrieve source, and it will automatically pull down that new field. So you see there it popped up. There's the description field we just created. So that's great. Now you can see here, Git has detected that we've changed two files. You can see it changed the layout file to add the new field, and we got a new file that represents the new field. So if we add both of those new files, or one new file and one modified file to our commit, and say in our commit message, added new description field to the client intake object, and hit commit. We've now added another package of changes. In this case, it's only 2 files to our Git repository. And the sync changes button will push those 2 changes up to our GitHub repository on account. And it says this action will pull and push. So if someone else had made changes to our GitHub repository, we'd also be pulling down those changes as part of this operation. But we're the only people working on this repo, so it's just going to be a push. And there we go. Our changes have been committed to our GitHub repo. So let's go back to our GitHub account. And if we refresh here, we can see that most of the files came up on our initial commit. So the commit message from the first commit is here, but you can see that the second commit message is here. So if I go into this folder, I can see which was the last commit of each of these files. So if we go to object and the client intake object and look at our new description field, you can see it has that second commit message on it. Now, if I go up a directory, I can actually look at what makes up a commit. So you can see it can see that in that commit, we added the field to the layout file, and we also added all the contents of the description file. Now, to get into more how you use Git and GitHub to compare commits and change sets, that's probably too big for this video, but you can kind of see how this might be a useful way to start working with the team. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.